Have you given any thought to contributing to the Melt? It's easy to do. Just click the Patreon link in the episode notes, and for as little as $3 a month, you can get access to bonus episodes, early access to regular episodes, and you can also participate in monthly Zoom meetups. It helps to keep the magic happening here at the Melt. So I encourage you to karmically entangle yourself with the Melt today by subscribing monthly for less than the price of a container of goatee wax, or a prosthetic pinky, or a half stick of DMT butter, or an inflatable casket, or the shrunken head of an Atlantean supermodel, or a woolly mammoth's merkin, or a crystalline replica of Baba Yaga's hut, or a capsule of Sasquatch dander.
This is Hunter Muse.
And this is Chris Snipes, and you are listening
to The Melt.
Austrian Rudolf Steiner was a clairvoyant from an early age. He later became an occultist, social reformer, architect, and esotericist. At the turn of the 20th century, Gregorian calendar, mind you, he founded an esoteric movement called anthroposophy, which was a mixture of science and spirituality. Steiner believed in ethical individualism, which he later wove spirituality into. He based his epistemology on Johann Wolfgang Goethe's worldview in which, quote, thinking is no more and no less an organ of perception than the eye or ear. Just as the eye perceives colors and the ear sounds, so thinking perceives ideas, end quote. He also believed that human knowledge was limitless. The complete works of his writing span some 330 volumes. He founded the Waldorf educational system that takes children through their various stages of development between the ages 3 and 18. His work inspired many, and his influence continues to be felt to this day. Today's guest, Dale Brunsvold, has taken on the task of reading aloud and recording all of Steiner's published writings, and has become quite an accomplished scholar on Steiner's works himself. I start off the conversation by asking Dale what it was that brought him to the project of recording audio versions of all of Steiner's works.
So first of all, of course, it was simply the impact of the man. Staggered me in college. I was in a graduate course in Wittgenstein, who I never did end up understanding anyway, but a guy in there was asking these very interesting questions of the professor, and the way he was phrasing the questions, I was just, puzzled by how he was doing that, percepts and concepts and all this stuff that weren't part of academic, philosophy as far as I was aware of. And he slid the Philosophy of Freedom across the table to me. I still have that copy, and that was 1978. And so, I started to read him and was absolutely, it was like coming home, as many people say, right? This is the other half of the world I was missing. So it's really very real for me, actually, even to this day. So anyway, I started teaching high school in a place called Jackson, Minnesota, and I had spare time, and in my spare time I started to record the basic books onto cassette. so that I could drive around in the car, or I had Walkmans. You remember the Walkman in those days?
Oh, yeah.
I had one of those.
Yes.
I'd walk to work and listen to them. And so that was the main reason. And then I had those. I did a few other things, but mostly the Christian cycles and stuff, maybe 10 books. And then, as the years went by, the internet, first MP3s came along, so pretty soon I could put a whole book on one disc, on one of these CD-ROM discs. Remember those days? Walkmans?
Oh, yeah.
Exactly. Would read those. And so I kind of had that around, but it wasn't till, the internet started to come into existence, and the Napster thing and all that kind of stuff from way back when, that it dawned on me, hey, maybe I'll do this, And so I wrote a letter to a man named Gene Goligly, who's passed away, and he was the CEO of Steiner Books in America. Where are you guys at, by the way?
We're in Lawrence, Kansas.
Oh, in Lawrence, Kansas. Okay. So he, to my surprise, about a month later, he wrote me back and said, "Yep, this is great. Go ahead and do that." So I was excited, and so I started to do all the books over again that I'd recorded before, and started putting that up. That was in 2005. So I've been doing it now. This is the beginning of the 18th year, and it's been maybe the last 7 or 8 years that it's really flowered, and people have taken to it seems, which is really a blessing. So I get, mail from people. They ask questions, and you guys ask me to do this, and and I'm like, okay, I'm just Joe Sixpack who just loves to read Steiner out loud. So that's really about it, to be honest with you. That's so.
I mean, you're probably one of a very few number of people who has read maybe as much Steiner as you have.
Yeah, well, I know. Do you go to study groups and stuff like that? How interested in Steiner personally are you guys?
My interest in Steiner just recently started peaking. Oh, yeah. I should have been attending study groups. They have them at the school, but
I see.
Yeah, I have not gone. And you just recently?
I just kind of woke up to Steiner when I moved back to Lawrence, and Chris's children were going to the Waldorf school, and so I just started to do a little bit of research through that avenue. And there's actually someone that I follow on social media, David Avocado Wolf.
Okay.
And he is a huge Steiner fan.
I didn't know
so he is. And he always, in many interviews, he'll bring him up. And so that's kind of just enlivened my interest.
Okay. Yeah. But I'll just mention in study groups and stuff that I do know quite a few people that have read a lot of Steiner.
Okay.
And the priests, for instance, in the Christian community, which, do you know about the Christian community at all?
I know a fair bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and forgive me for asking that, just so I don't bore
no
people.
problem.
But so we have a Christian community here in Denver. It was, and for people that don't know about it, it was guided into existence by Steiner through the request of a number of people that wanted to return to a ritual that wasn't cluttered up by old forms that acknowledged the modern form of consciousness, etc., etc. But it's, again, on the other hand, very traditional as a mass. You would be surprised how similar it is to that. So anyway, those guys pretty much read it all.
Yeah.
If they're,
cool. So you have a community of people that you can sit around and talk Steiner with if you need to.
If I need to anymore, I did for many years, 30 years or so, and right now I'm not so much. And I've got all the Facebook anthroposophical groups that I love to write in and practice writing, and stuff.
Yeah.
So and then
It's such fascinating stuff. One thing that always just blows my mind is how did he stumble into this wisdom? How did he arrive at this place where he knew all of this stuff, or he learned all of this stuff, or was open to it?
And again, we're taking Steiner at face value when we're talking about all this. I don't actually know these things in my own direct experience, as you all know. So I'm not, by the way, ever saying I'm a clairvoyant or any of that kind of stuff. And I can only hope that as I communicate this, that I'm doing as accurate a job as I can. But I get carried away. I get excited sometimes. So when that happens, you go, Dale, say that again, just in case you were too excited to think straight there for a second. But anyway, he tells his story in his autobiography, which is, have you ever read that? It's really quite surprising.
I have not.
Because here's this guy who's this giant, and all he does it's called the course of my life, in one translation, the story of my life, and now the newest one is just called his autobiography. And all he does is talk about everybody he knew. So the whole book is about these other people, which is kind of astonishing, really, and how much they affected him and how his life turned in this direction because of them and his love for this teacher. And it's just really quite remarkable that he wrote that way. But yeah, so when he was about either 7 to 9, he had a spiritual experience of an aunt that had committed suicide. And he was at a train station area. His dad ran he was some kind of a train station master. And she appealed to him and said, please help me when if you can, because of my situation from suicide. And, he apparently had a form of natural clairvoyance when he was a child and experienced the nature spirits of the world and whatever types of things he did. And that was just kind of always there. And then he met a man named Kogutsky, Felix Kogutsky, I believe his name was, who was an herb gatherer on his trips on the train when he was going to Vienna or someplace like that. And he found this man to be very wise. And it's possible he was a very deep initiate of some kind, but we don't really know that. He never explicitly said. And seemed to bring him into a world that he then, explored further. But it's also possible, and we really don't know, that his clairvoyance got richer and deeper and broader to the point where he could possibly communicate with these people around the world that are, that don't need to be there physically with each other, let's say, right? And all of this then is tied into what appears to have been kind of a world destiny of a reincarnating individuality who was just really, really huge. So he's only been dead 100 years, not even 100 years. And everything that he's doing, I think, is just going to grow and permeate our culture and our society a little bit at a time as, we try to deal with, the crises of the world, which wake us up and make us ask deeper questions than our complacency otherwise would, right? If everything's working fine, he'll probably, during the pandemic experience anyway, the site went nuts, for instance, right? And it never really has gotten quieter. That was a massive leap in the activity of it and everything. So interesting, right? Not surprising. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but
sure.
It's interesting because David Avocado Wolf talks about the potential, he opines that he is the reincarnation of Aristotle.
So Steiner then, as part of the story, you've seen his building, and I don't know if you're going to put visuals up on this, but his building, the Goetheanum, the very first school for spiritual science that he was the architect of in Dornach, Switzerland, was burned down by arson on New Year's Eve, 1922 to the next day, 1923. It burned through the night. I always thought if they ever did a movie of Steiner, that's how they'd start it myself.
Yes, exactly.
Very intense, and so a year later, at Christmas time that year, he did something unusual. He really united with the society before he'd just been a teacher, and kind of held the anthroposophical movement, and he let other people run a bureaucratic institution kind of parallel to that he wasn't involved in. And as a spiritual teacher, he said, you don't get involved in those things generally. It just causes issues with your clairvoyance, with your ability to bring these ideas to the people or to the world. But he did make the decision at that time to take on the presidency of the society as well as continue being the teacher. And before that, he then gave a series of lectures before the conference, which was a 2-week-long conference through Christmas time, like from the 25th of December to maybe the 6th of January, something like that. I don't know the exact dates. And in that, he did, in fact, seem to, but he's never direct about this. He never said he was anybody, unless it was to private people, in conversation, but never publicly announced these kinds of things. And he said an initiate never would do that. So if anybody ever does that, you generally go, okay, we'll keep that guy at arm's length and see what happens.
Yeah,
I'm not going to dismiss him outright, but okay, that's who you think you were. All right. So anyway, he then, and you can read these lectures and you get this picture of that he was probably talking about his own incarnations. Okay. And then when Ita Wegman died, who was a doctor, worked at the Arlesheim Clinic, who was a very close colleague of his, he gave her these kind of poems that were these cryptic poems that seemed to talk about their reincarnations together through the past. And they begin, believe it or not, with references to Enkidu and Gilgamesh.
Wow.
Okay. So that's, and then it goes from there to Aristotle, St. Thomas Aquinas. Okay. And a reincarnation supposedly of Steiner, etc. And there probably were others in there that, he didn't mention, but he mentioned the ones where she was Alexander during the time he was Aristotle, for example, in these kinds of things. And again, that stuff can start to sound a little loony. So, and I don't know, interesting. I mean, his stature to me is so difficult to fathom.
Sure.
It's like a man named Owen Barfield, who, I don't know if you know who Owen Barfield is, a great scholar, very popular in America, besides being an anthroposophist. Wrote a book called Saving the Appearances and Romanticism Comes of Age, and just really wonderful writer from England. He said once, and he knew Steiner. He was a Brit, Oxford Don guy. And he goes, as time went on, he said, and I attempted over and over again to take a measure of the stature of Steiner, he said, it became a burden too excessive to be borne.
Wow.
Because he just, the guy was more than he just ever thought he was. And then the next time he experienced him, he was more than that. And it just took his breath away over and over again. And he was a lawyer and an Oxford Don. And I mean, he's a very prestigious writer. The Wesleyan Press does all his books in America. And he passed away at 99 about maybe 10, 11 years ago. Am I rambling?
No,
okay.
You are here to ramble.
Okay.
That's your job tonight, is to ramble.
And right behind me, if you can see that, is a 30-foot high sculpture that Steiner did that was going to be in the first Goetheanum, but it was burned down. But luckily it was being constructed in what was called the Schreinerei, which was a carpenter shop that didn't burn down. And it shows these 3 temptations of the Christ that Steiner describes in his own way there. And so Lucifer and Ahriman are all in that thing. So that's a fun for, yeah.
I definitely want to get to Ahriman a little later because I think he plays a role in this world we're currently living in right now, for sure.
Yeah.
For those who aren't, well, actually, let me quickly say first, it makes sense that he has such incarnations of notoriety, because it seems like his vast amount of wisdom that he seemed to possess was just too much to collect in one lifetime. It seemed like it had to come over from somewhere else, and that he was just kind of adding to it throughout this life. So that makes total sense. Yeah. But for the listeners who aren't familiar with anthroposophy, maybe you could sum that up. I mean, within reason.
I guess, his definition that he attempted at the end of his life is through discovering the wisdom in the human being to rediscover the spiritual wisdom in the universe is kind of what it is. So through, working on yourself and developing these organs of cognition, actually organs of perception that are in our subtle bodies, and we can talk about that at length, I'm afraid, that you begin to have perceptions from organs of perception other than your physical ones. But, the ones we use now, we take a hold of them with our thinking, and we cognize our experience. We build our world at a certain level, even though, it awakens that in us by this given phenomena we experience. And he says, well, all meditation really is reawakening, actually, because they used to be awake in the evolution of consciousness way in the past. We're reawakening these organs of perception, and we will begin to receive data from those respective worlds. And in our scientific modality of our time, he said, which is a great blessing, even though it's abused in some ways, but it is nevertheless this new form of consciousness, kind of an imprinted on us by what science is. And so we have an objectivity now that we really never had before, that we can now take hold of these things and enter into the spiritual world without being overshadowed by higher beings, without being in ecstasy modes, without having to go into trances. Even though a lot of those, he calls them atavistic modes of clairvoyance, are still around, he says that their time has passed, and we really need to step into this kind of wide awake, fully conscious way of beginning to experience the spiritual world. And that I liked. And then he said, and look, I'll show you what you can do with it. So we get biodynamic agriculture, you know that, right? And we get Waldorf education, and we get anthroposophical medicine, which is practiced by thousands of doctors all over the world. Valeda pharmaceuticals, he talked about how to process pharmaceutical things using biodynamic produce as his growth things. Dr. Hauschka products were all designed out of inspirations of Steiner. Uriel pharmacy. And really just goes on, and eurythmy and all these other things. And he did it all in 25 years. He started everything he did when he was 40 and died at 65. So just that last little chapter of his life poured all of this stuff out, with
It's
such
amazing.
Selflessness. I mean, just, yeah. Anyway, where were we? So anthroposophy, we could say ideally it would really be this method of existential experience that we ourselves would raise ourselves to, and then practice those experiences and practice that knowledge. But in a way, that's not happening, at least, and no one's sharing their experiences. And I, really don't have them except for tiny things that just, don't matter to anybody else. And I'm not, but, and so really what it does amount to, I think, in our time for now, in this kind of gestation period, is his knowledge, the body of knowledge of Rudolf Steiner is essentially anthroposophy. And that's kind of almost a sad thing to say, in a way, right? And yet there are probably people out there that are really working on this that are, making a difference, in that sense, through meditation and all these kinds of other things. I'll mention also when you talk about knowing and how did Steiner know. So one of the things that happens through these initiations and the awakening of these organs of perception, he claims, is that you begin to be able to experience a memory life that belongs to the earth. That the earth is in fact a living being. It's a being it has a physical body and an etheric body and an astral body, and its ego is the Christ being. Okay, but that only happened after the mystery of Golgotha. And this being is intimately connected to the evolution of the human race. We are really together and we don't know it anymore, right? We've lost that, the reality of that. We know it and yet we don't experience it, maybe is a better way to say it. And so he would enter into the memory life of the earth, and as a disciplined, scientific, advanced, initiate clairvoyant, he could say, I need to understand something about Newtonian, physics. Well, he could talk to Newton in a certain way. He could actually go into union with that, what was of that person in this memory life, right? And he could go into the inner life of the Romans at a certain period of time, or the Greeks, right? And so imagine if you could do that, how you would gather knowledge in a way very different from how you and I are going to pour through those textbooks, you know what I mean? And go to our classes, right? So, his ability to do that. And then also there were also abilities of, as a wonderful musician I love, Bruce Coburn says, when the questions contain their own reply. right?
Mm-hmm.
Right, that kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah.
And he, go ahead.
I think that we do know it. And I think what happens is that when an infant is born, that may be why the infant cries, because there's a separation now from that earth into humanity. I think maybe that's the bifurcation that happens. And we are tapped into this earth knowing, but we just turn the volume down as we feel like we become more of the world as opposed to in the world.
Nice, yeah.
Or
go ahead.
I was just going to say, or our society turns the volume down.
Yeah. And another analogy is that our senses become so powerful. It's like bright sunlight. Well, aren't there stars behind the sun? Well, I can't see them, but can I? So meditation is really a form of negating the information from your physical sense organs and not falling asleep, because that's normally how you fall asleep, is shutting that down. So how do I build a strong enough soul life that when I shut off my physical senses, I'm awake? And if you did, Steiner says, the spiritual world would actually pour into you. And at the beginning, you'd sort of be like a crying baby, because it would be a new world you have to re-engage with and learn there, just as you and I had to struggle all that time to come into the destiny this world has. Yeah. And I like that story. I think that's a cool idea. I hope he's right.
Yeah, exactly. Well, what you were talking about earlier about him having access to all these people and bodies of knowledge, it sounds like a little bit like I've heard tapping into an Akashic record.
That's what he calls it. And that's what he calls it. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. How did he describe that? Was that just some like an energy, for lack of a better term, grid or field that contained all of experience and all of knowledge?
Yeah. And he would say it was a spiritual world. He tended to, though he did occasionally, he tried not to use words that are from the physical realm, like energies, right?
Sure.
Vibrations. These are common words in, like, say, New Age terminology. And in a way, people don't want to kind of realize, or dimensions, right? There are these dimensions. It's still all physical, right? That's still all physicality. And he's going, no. This is a spiritual world. Each of the worlds, the etheric world, has its qualities, its beings that live in it, its relationships that are there. In the astral world, same thing, a completely different world of spirituality. And then finally, the pure spiritual world that our ego eventually, our real self, shall we say, eventually enters into, let's say, after death. And we perform the deeds and actions we need to do there in order for a new incarnation to be fruitful, right? And so so spiritual materialism is really also an Ahrimanic kind of delusion, and we really like it because we feel safe in all those ideas. They're the conceptual forms, right, that we are in, and he kept trying to pull us out of that all the time.
I wonder if it's like layers of an onion, and there's a membrane between physicality and spirituality then he was basically piercing, and that's how he had access to it.
Yeah, I think that's a good analogy too. Yeah, and again, it's a question of these organs of perception in your etheric. So, what about these bodies? Is this something we want to discuss? Just to kind of
absolutely. That was the next question I was going to ask.
And why not? Right. So first of all, his typology for the human being, instead of just being what you and I know and what our culture teaches us, where you have a physical body. It's alive, whatever that is. You've got this consciousness thing, whatever that is, and then you think, right? But so your physical senses and your thinking, that's kind of the two bodies, you might say, that we consider to be, that's okay. We can talk about that. That's the real world, right? Thinking itself is very interesting, right? Because people immediately, instead of wanting to talk about thinking, they want to talk about the ground of thinking, which we could call the electrical activity of the brain. Fine. But I don't want to talk about the activity of the brain. I want to talk about thinking. Yeah, but it's just this. And I go, it really isn't. I mean, it is. I don't have any experience of electrical activity of my brain. I have experience of thinking and self-awareness. Why are you dodging my point? Why are you telling me I'm supposed to look somewhere else when I'm right in the middle of this? Isn't that weird? Yeah. It's like saying, water. Well, yeah, water's just hydrogen and oxygen. You don't have to talk about water. Well, hydrogen and oxygen have nothing to do with water. When those two things come together, a whole new set of qualities emerge into the universe that aren't there before. And in consciousness, and et cetera, is like that. And it's one of the sad things of science is this reductionism. It doesn't want to take the things that are problematic. It feels unscientific there. So it goes, let's talk about electrical activity. We could prod this thing, and son of a God, we got memories coming out. Oh, you're feeling that, are you? Fine. It's confusing, and that's okay. So Steiner says, first of all, this was so beautiful to me that he just unites us with the three kingdoms of nature: the mineral kingdom, the plant kingdom, and the animal kingdom, which each themselves seem to have a set of forces, right, going on in them that the other ones don't have. Now, and he says they're forces. Now, we see the secondary epiphenomenal activity of those forces manifesting on the physical plane. So we could talk about life, even though life itself is pure spiritual activity. Nevertheless, it does separate cells and move glandular juices in this organism. And we just get like Plato's cave analogy. We just stare at that stuff and go, yeah, that's life. Yep. Well, he goes, no, that's the result of life penetrating the organism, raising it to this higher organization. And by the way, we can do this with those life forces, and we can handle them in this way for medicine, and we can process plants in such a way, knowing about life forces and their connection to the stars and the planets, to make them grow better. And all of that stuff has been pretty darn verified. Okay, so that again, that's that science side rather than nebulous mysticism. It's wide awake adult clairvoyance penetrating into this stuff. That's so cool to me. Anyway, so we have this mineral body, and our mineral body is losing 330 billion cells a day. They're falling off our organism. It's like a river. We really live in a river. We just can't quite see it, except when you got to clean your house, right? There's detritus is all over the place, right? And so these life forces, which we look at the plant realm and go, there they are. There's the life forces. They're not in that mineral realm. They're not there. Now, he says they are outside it. They just don't penetrate it. And that's interesting. As a clairvoyant, he can see that kind of, right? So we say, thank you, plant realm, because in a way, it's from you that this body of life forces has, become part of the organism I could eventually incarnate into, right? And it took a huge amount of time for evolution to prepare something that was a fitting instrument that the ego could wake up in, right? And actually spiritually develop from then on. And that's beautiful to me. But our etheric body is very old, whereas the etheric body and it's very different. The etheric body of the plant realm, as Steiner says, is a multiplicity of elemental beings. Sylphs, gnomes, salamanders, undines, right? You've heard these phrases before, these elemental beings. And that multiplicity of those beings is the plant realm, the life of the plant realm. Whereas my life body, your etheric bodies, they're really more a unity. We gather them together during the time we come into conception, during the time that conception is occurring. We draw those from, and it's all, part of it is all our karma, what we can draw from that world and how we draw from that world and what we have to draw from that world, right? Because we got to go through these things, right? And then what does that thing do? Well, it immediately starts battling the death of your physical body. Now, your physical body is dying this is my way of putting it. It's dying all the time. Right? And
sure.
There's life bodies in there just tenaciously, there's an etheric heart building your heart. There's etheric lungs building your lungs. It's incredibly differentiated. He says it's way more complicated than the physical realm is. Way more complicated. And it's really in time, not in space. So you could try to take a photograph of it, but it's immediately something else because of its constant movement in that realm, right? But it's also totally, and we have to use these physical analogies, recording every moment of your life. an absolute 100% vivid 3D reality, or however we can say it, right? So that when we die, there's if we have a crisis and there's any separation of our etheric body from our physical body, even for a split second, instead of this tenacious, building our physical organism, those forces are freed up and they dive into our consciousness. And when they do, our life passes before our eyes.
Mm-hmm.
It's always pregnantly waiting for death, really, for that to happen, right? At death, we'll have that experience fully as part of the natural excarnation process, leaving the physical realm and gradually finding our way into the spiritual realm. I like this. I think this is good, Steiner. Keep going, And so then we've got that, and there's tons of other things about the etheric body. Okay, we're not even, I'm just giving you a rough picture of the framework of a human being that Waldorf teachers use. Okay, Waldorf teachers are really paying attention to this, right? So then we look at the animal realm. We go, there's a whole new set of forces operative in the animal realm that are not in the plant realm and that are not in the mineral realm. And we can call them consciousness forces if you want to. Sentience, sense organs, inner life of the animals, right? They don't have that. And people go, oh no, Venus flytrap has that. And we can talk about those exceptions, but Steiner's takes them on. Takes them on directly. When I won't distract with that. And so here we are. Sure, we're beings of passions and impulses and desires like the animal realm, right? And I have this consciousness that my self-consciousness resides in. But I have consciousness, you might say, our unconscious. The astral world, you could say in general, that's what it's called, the astral body as well. It's kind of our unconsciousness in a way, right? Just to use those psychological terms. So then so here we have these three kingdoms of nature, and I'm carrying them around with me. That's so cool. That is so cool. Of course I am.
Yes.
How could I not be connected to the world, right? Well, because you taught me I wasn't connected to the world society. Okay, well, you were wrong, okay? Because I sure as hell am, I find that so weird. This stuff was so weird because the common sense of it, you just didn't know what to do with it. You just, what? Why don't we know this anymore? You know what I mean? For heaven's sake. Not hell's sake. I apologize for that. So then on top of all that, then we have the human kingdom. Oh, well, Dale, you really don't. You're just animals. Well, okay, science. I'm sorry. You're a little carried away there. You just don't want to deal with consciousness. You just don't want to deal with self-awareness. You don't want to do it. I don't know why. Someday you will. But right now you're just stubborn, And, and so that's that fascinating story of reincarnation and karma. And that arises out of our need to develop to God again, to the higher hierarchies again, with new faculties that are in the design, as painful as the birth process is, right? And, and I'm like, I like that story. It gives me purpose. I'm fascinated. This could be true. I got nothing else from the world right now, so I'm going to take this one, right? As my best story I found, kind of thing, And what else really do I have? I'm not going to pretend to know something I don't know. I'm an adult, for heaven's sake, right? So here we have these four bodies, and we have them applied in Waldorf education. We have them applied in biodynamic agriculture. We have them applied in like eurythmy, if you've ever seen eurythmy. You guys ever seen that? I mean, it's totally gorgeous. Doing it is so cool. If you guys could ever get a chance to do that. I had, in Denver, I had such wonderful opportunities over the years. But there's just something tantalizing right on the edge of eurythmy, this visible speech and visible music, that you just know that's right. But I don't know why I know that. You know what I mean? It's tantalizing. It's a wonderful experience. His artwork is very challenging in that way. He always said, no, in the future, we're going to create form through color. So we won't be filling in we'll take color and that in itself is kind of a spiritually cool picture to imagine, right? And if you've seen some of the great artists that have really applied that, you can see how there are layers and layers of color and the forms are arising out of that, right? Mm-hmm. There's something, cool about that.
Absolutely.
So then to just give one picture of why these bodies are beautiful as well is the development of the child from birth to 21. So this happens in these gorgeous 7-year periods, right? And Steiner says that even though there's a lot of people poo-pooing this, he said your etheric body essentially replaces all your physical substance every 7 years, not the cells. Because some cells stay, like brain cells, you can keep those all your life. Most of them anyway. but the substances in the cells are changed out. Okay, so he would say, I think, in that sense. So from 0 to 7 years old, he says, roughly, again, these, especially with culture and influence of parenting and everything. Your body is very dedicated to taking the substances from the parents and replacing them with substances it itself is creating. So that by the age of 7, your body is now your first body.
Yeah.
Right? And he says, and if you go in there and try to activate the intellect or try to teach the child intellectually, well, that's done with etheric forces. Your etheric forces are what your thinking is. That's where the root of thinking is. So what you're actually doing, Steiner says very directly, seeing it directly as a clairvoyant, is you're stealing from your child certain sets of forces that need to do what they're doing right now because that's their God-given purpose right now. If the child wants to imitate, take that imitation. Let that child imitate the richest environment you can possibly muster for it, because it'll learn like crazy, as we all know, right? But oh no, I'm gonna make that sucker clever at 3 or 4 years old. Like, we know tons of stories of people, the problematic nature of their psychology when they're older from those kinds of things. Anyway, I'm not beating on any parents. I'm just saying this is common sense in our day to get them as smart as you can for college as fast as you can, right? And he's going, no, you're damaging the organ. It's going to have rheumatisms and arthritises when it's in its 50s and 60s, causally connected to this. That's another clairvoyant thing that's kind of cool, right? Seeing the organic realm like I see a rock busted by a hammer. And you're watching the etheric realm with that same kind of clarity of causality, right? That's what a clairvoyant can also do, right? So then at 7, your body has finished this first construction of the organism. And built it itself, and it gets rid of the last remaining substances from the parents, the hardest ones. And Steiner said, when you see the milk teeth begin to be thrust out by these life forces, he says there's kind of part of the etheric body that really changes and really kind of forms a more defined region around the head. And he says, and consciousness does a qualitative leap. Like going from a stem to a leaf in a plant or something, right? Something completely new occurs. And I say it this way, sort of a morally saturated pictorial consciousness just starts to given birth in the child. You tell it stories and the impacts and the images it creates and the right and wrongs and all that stuff. The inner life is just deeply, profoundly affected by that. For example, right? But then there's also at 9, there's a significant change that occurs, and we're not going to go into that all. But then another 7 years occurs, interestingly, and at 14. So he says, by the way, that at 7, then your etheric body is unsheathed. He says before that it's sort of a protective sheath, let's say. That's an analogy. He says it's unsheathed. So then he says the ideal educational age for a child is 7 to 14. There's a part there, if it's done right, that is the greatest blessing for teaching, he says. And he was a magnificent teacher even before, anthroposophy, you could say. That's another part of his biography. So then at 14, next 7-year period, the astral body is unsheathed, and your body of and you get kind of the formal operations thinking of Piaget kind of starts to emerge. Very much, the bone structure grows. Consciousness, you kind of separate one more step away from the world, at the same time that this new thinking can penetrate that more distant world more deeply than it did before. And that happens a lot. A separation and a more deeper penetration because of it, which is kind of a delicious paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then from 14 to 21, you have the growth and emergence of those qualities of the astral body. And then he says finally at 21, which we used to call coming of age, the ego has actually unsheathed and born into these 3 now independently made by you bodies. So you've remade your physical body 3 times, right, etc., all these kinds of things. And now in that next 7-year period from 21 to 28, he talks about what he calls the sentient soul period of your life, where this new independent ego living in these 3 bodies reaches out into the world and meets people and learns from people and starts to integrate itself into the society around it. Meanwhile, the ego immediately dives down into its astrality and tries to ennoble it. It tries to bring it into eternal. It tries to take this astral body and make it an eternal body. It wants to
Interesting.
It wants to do that, okay? And it can't, of course, very much. But meditation, right? All these kinds of things then would allow the efficacy of that attempt to be stronger, to be more efficacious, I guess you could say, right?
Sure.
And so that's happening at that time really strongly, but it continues throughout your life. And then from 28 to 35, he calls that the period of the intellectual or mind soul. And that's when the ego kind of dives down into your etheric body. And it wants to transform it. And things like a rhythmic life, a life that has some form of religious, and he doesn't care what that religion is, because there's something in the religious life that calls us into a certain place in ourselves, if it's practiced in a nice way, right? And also that's the root of our thinking life. So that's the intellectual soul period. You think about people getting their PhDs, finishing off their academic education by then, and moving on into life. That's interesting. And then finally from 35 to 42, your ego actually even tries to go into your physical body and change it. And these things are now, we're talking millions of years in the future that anything's going to happen, but it's already trying. It's its impulse. And interesting that we have existential crises then, because you're meeting the body of death, you might say, that you have, right?
Yeah.
At a very unconscious level. And each of these, of course, is a subtle transformation of consciousness that's been happening in you above and beyond what you may have taken on consciously, which is a whole other kettle of fish, right? How much have you decided to really do this yourself? Or are you just going to flow with the natural evolution we're all going through, right? As humanity, it's going to happen anyway. It's just you decided to stay in the pack, as it were. Yeah. Okay. I think that's about it. So now you see the human being in a way as Steiner sees the human being, more or less, right?
Yeah,
and its impact, its practical impact, all over in all these other things. Go ahead, dear.
I'm curious what his perspective on cellular memories and DNA would be, because that first period you're talking about from 0 to 7, there's a lot of research and study surrounding children and psychic ability and the ability to have this clairvoyance and these, what I would consider like DNA memories. So I wonder how Steiner would approach that, or what his thoughts would be, because you mentioned that the child at that point is taking on kind of what they've learned from their parents, or the DNA that they've received from their parents, and they're morphing that into their own structure. What are your thoughts about that?
So that etheric body is quite large in a child, right? It's let's say it's out here, and then as you get older, it gradually constricts till it's close to your own body, and you're less powerful then. And part of that is when you get your first memory. So do you remember you're maybe 2.5, 3 years old? I don't know if I can remember my first memory, but a lot of people do, right? The moment that occurs, that world of spiritual experience you were probably having is gone, right? Because now you know you. Now you are the awareness, right? And before that awareness was a cosmic one, and actually kind of was a cosmic one, right? Now I'm kind of saying that out of myself. Okay, that wasn't absolutely Steiner talking right there, fair enough. But it's kind of Steiner, right? It's taking some of those components. But he talks a lot about that. And I think what happens is part of, you're talking about how does he know, where does this Akashic record thing come from? He talks about getting to that boundary as an initiate, as a person who's training their spiritual awareness. They get to the boundary of their own memory life, and then they go through it. Well, what memory life are they experiencing now, right? So you kind of pass to the, as I think of it, you sort of pass to the Akashic world through your own etheric body's memory life, and you're transcending your private one and beginning to experience the cosmic one as such, yeah? So and he does talk a little bit about our memories as being body-based, that there's something There's something integrated in the organism, but the etheric body has to go back in. It's almost like a seed, he says. And the etheric body has to go back in when you decide you want to remember something. And it grabs kind of hold of that seed and blossoms it back into what you call the memory you're having in your consciousness again. And some people are really good at that, and others are less good, and and it changes as you get older. But he does say, obviously we know it's memory based, because when your brain is damaged, right, by some kind of injury, your memories are gone, etc. And the deterioration of it in cases of Alzheimer's. So we know that these things are kind of founded in the memory life, but eventually they wouldn't be. One of the goals of spiritual development is to not think using the physical brain anymore, but to think directly out of the etheric body. And in fact, that's how it was done in Atlantis. In Atlantis, Steiner says they didn't have linear sequential reasoning capabilities. They had a perfect memory. So anytime they had a new experience, they called upon a perfect memory to find, even if it was 2 + 2 = 4, they did not logically connect that together. They had a perfect memory of the 2 and the 2 and the 4 and recognized them for that, without having a logical thought process, which is incredibly hard to imagine. Okay, that kind of thing. So, and again, that goes back to his other fundamental idea, this notion of the evolution of consciousness, which, is quite something. So that there was a time in the past when all of humanity was clairvoyant, naturally clairvoyant. In fact, our sleep life was more awake in terms of a comparison with the day-waking consciousness than our day-waking consciousness is. And those are reversed. So we feel more awake when we're awake than when we're asleep. Then it was the other way around. And the other part of it is that because our etheric bodies were huge, and again, it has to do with these 4 bodies and their relationships changing throughout history that causes these changes in consciousness, kind of obviously, I could say. But the life of the hierarchies, the spiritual beings, participated in our life of consciousness in such a way that, and you could say it this way, that we were sort of coerced by their presence. They guided us in a way we weren't selves yet. We were coming into selfhood. And that was part of the development, but we were guided. We were guided enormously in the past by this. So much so that, seeing the pyramids, seeing all these amazing constructions in ancient Egypt and before, we think, somebody sat down and figured that out. And I don't, Steiner was never explicit about it, but you get the impression from him that it was like a great common mind of astonishing wisdom that worked into these realms. And we can't imagine it that way. So we think there was just some smart guy who came up with everything, right? And then ordered these people around, kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
And right. So gradually these hierarchical beings, angels, as he calls them, he uses Christian terminology, but ashpasans and, in some of the Indian work and stuff, they're all very similar in some ways. They receded. And as they receded, we then needed some way to continue. And what we did is we took hold of our physical sense organs more and more and more. And we got really serious about what I was getting from them. And this thinking life that was now only reflected by the mechanism of the brain. So the brain is a reflecting mechanism, Steiner says, that allows us to see consciousness on the physical plane. Otherwise, we wouldn't see it. We wouldn't be in it. Isn't that wild? And he says then that it's a corpse. We don't get an experience of the direct thinking. All we get are the images, like a corpse-like, image-like experience of thinking. But we're free. We're free because it's only images, and images don't compel us.
Do you think that one of the mistakes, for lack of a better term, that modern science sees when it's seeing what the brain does is, as opposed to, I see it as being an interface. It's an interface between maybe the spiritual realm and the physical realm, whereas they may see it as the source, like
Exactly.
It stops there. Yeah, like things are created there as opposed to going through it.
And I absolutely agree with you in every way.
Okay.
And he said that. Steiner says it. He critiques science and says they think the brain produces thoughts like the liver does spittle, right, or the spleen does bile. Right. But I think it's what you say. It's just the complexity of it allows us. If you read The Philosophy of Freedom, right, for instance, you'll love this. This is really quite something. So here he is saying, look out in the world. And you're seeing all these life forces diving down into matter and creating trees and fish and all these forms in the world, for heaven's sake, right? And he says, and so these forces, and a little bit of this is me, these forces create the human form. And this is what dawned on me one day. But, the human form is a special form. In fact, it's the first form. All the other ones came from us. All the other ones devolved from us, from Steiner, and Bucky Fuller, I love, was into that in his book, The Critical Path, right? But what I thought is, okay, but so there's something harmonically resonant about the human form in relation to the cosmos. The Bible says we're created in the image of God, whatever that means, right? And I think what it means is we could use a modern analogy that we're like a hologram in some metamorphosed way of the entire cosmos. So when these life forces that spend their passion in a plant or spend their passion in the form of an animal create me or create you, there's a superabundance of them left over in us. Because it was so easy to make us, because we're just its image in the writ small, right? And because there was a superabundance of life forces that were left over, only in us were they able to meet each other, like the caduceus snakeheads in the caduceus. That's my image of that, right? And when life forces attempted to formatively form themselves, a psychic space opened up in the human being that allowed the ego to incarnate. Only in us. Okay? And Steiner says, what you see outside is the whole world of life and activity and all that stuff. In the human being, you experience as your life of thinking. That's directly Steiner. And that's astonishing to me. So my life of thinking is the inner metamorphosed manifestation of something spending its passion in outer physical forms. Well, look at all the forms you and I create in our life of thought. Everything. I mean, we can do anything we want there in a certain amazing way, right? And that's because, and anyway, so part of that's me, that whole idea of the hologram and stuff. But I don't think I'm off there too much. I think he'd give me a break on that one.
I feel he would too. It seems like in the Steiner cosmos, everything, which I think is completely and utterly obvious, everything is intrinsically intertwined, right? And it seems like in the world of material reductionism, what it seems to be trying to do is to divide things up and draw lines, very, very pronounced, bold lines in between different realms or different ideas or different parts of the body or different parts of nature. And I think that's a false way of looking at things, because there are no fine boundary or no bold and hard boundaries between things. And I think that's one of the big mistakes of materialism is inculcating that separation. And I think that then manifests into people thinking that they're separate from each other and that, this and that can go on in my head and it's not going to affect the next guy because it's taking place in me, but really it isn't. It's leaking everywhere, Yeah. So what you feed yourself physically and mentally is what you're feeding the world in return.
Yep. But we could also say as well that was also ordained, that the evolution of consciousness and the separating of humanity from the spiritual world, which is called the fall, right, in the Bible, right, was purposeful. And out of that, we became free beings. Well, only free beings can manifest the highest love. You can have the love of animals and biology and all that stuff, and that's a love, but it's not the highest love, right? The highest love comes out of freedom. So we needed to have that, darn it, kind of thing. And part of that is that in our cognition, our organization is such that the concepts that actually, as you said, live in all the percepts I get from my senses, they're already there. But in our organization, they're separated. So all I get are percepts, and the minute I get them, my thinking kicks in and goes, what is that? How is that connected to that, right? And we create all this conceptual life that starts to bring the world back into synthesis, back into unity, right? But it's our creation now. We're bringing that into being in our own souls, right? So that's the upside and the downside. So we even needed the separation, sir, in a certain way, right? And now we're battling, and already I think we're knowing, hey, this has gone on long enough. We really got to get a move on here because the earth is dying. You know what I mean? We're destroying the darn thing out of this cognition, right? Out of the very cognition you're talking about. And that's, I think, why people like Steiner and Wolf and these people are people are waking up to this. Now, they're very cautious because there's so much charlatanry and there's so many crazy people out there who I think in most cases are partially clairvoyant. But it's not proper clairvoyance. They haven't trained themselves properly. And you can easily get a skewed pathological clairvoyance, right? Think of all of it. I mean, I don't want to badmouth some of these people, but we know, sexual issues that show up in these people so horribly, for example, right? All the way to India, everywhere, right? So it's not an easy thing. And in Steiner's path of initiation, his book, Knowledge of Higher Worlds and Its Attainment, is by far the most conservative, difficult path you could ever follow. But he says, if you do all the way, you're protected. You would be protected from these pathologies, because you'll get to a point where if your pathology persists, you won't go any farther until you fix that kind of thing, right? So the greatest teacher of that we've ever had so far, that I know of anyway, right? There's many masters that stay invisible, Steiner said. Only once in a while does one step out and sacrifice for the public. It's a sacrifice for them to do that. And I agree. I'm sure it was. I mean, he had to deal with a lot of awful stuff. The burning down of the building and all that stuff. The beautiful, beautiful building. Yeah.
At one point, you mentioned that during the evolution of humanity, dreams were the real place, and the waking world was more the sleepy place. What was Steiner's take on dreams? What did he think that the role of the dream was? And was that some concoction of the brain or the interface, or was that sort of like another spiritual place that we were visiting and interacting with?
Yeah, that one's hard. I noticed that. I read a lot of Jung when I was younger, and I really enjoyed, the idea of the collective unconscious and the dream life that, he was so amazingly into. And Steiner, he was not very complimentary to modern psychoanalysis. He considered it that these people, first of all, didn't take their own inner work seriously enough, and came out as dilettantes. Okay, I'm not, I love these guys. So when I say that, I'm saying what Steiner said, right? But so when he would talk about dreams, he would often show, because it was a very important stage of consciousness. So, for instance, in your thinking, you're wide awake. In your feeling life, you're dreaming. You're not wide awake in your dream. And in your will, you're completely asleep. So you don't really know. You and I cannot follow a thought of taking my hand and lifting it from the thought of having it and consciously follow the path all the way to my hand being lifted. There's a place in there where absolute unconsciousness is the rule, right? And so he takes these three things very seriously. And so the dreaming he takes very seriously. And most of the time he tends to, say, well, he characterizes things like, you have a dream about being in a fire somewhere, and you wake up and all your covers are over you and you're too hot. And that's where the dream came from. So there's this uncontrolled, but you're completely embedded in that world, right? When you're having a dream, you're so into that dream that like you're not in even your wide awake consciousness, the whole thing. So he spends time on it quite a bit in some places. There's that. I don't know if I'm saying that very well, to be honest with you. At the same time that your dream consciousness is transformed in initiation. So part of knowledge of the higher worlds, one of the chapters is called the continuity of consciousness. Okay, so that can be maintained. But generally speaking, I think it was a danger. I think that was probably why he kind of kept it at a distance and didn't want people to be too involved in it, frankly, was that they would kind of go off into some nebulous mystical land. And he said the work to be done needs to be done out of the wide awake ego and not falling into any kind of less than that in yourself. Even though in those places there's more than there is in thinking, right? Those worlds are larger worlds, right? And on the other hand, and they're penetrated by this initiation, but you're wide awake during that thing, and then all the treasures of them, flood into you. Yeah. So now what happened if we go back to the past, of course, is the dream life they're having their consciousness, let's say, is saturated by the guidance of higher beings. So when they're in that dream life, they're experiencing spiritual beings and perhaps being taught by them and all this other stuff. So it's a completely different world. We use the word dreaming, but I don't think it has anything to do with ours at all to speak of, except that, you call it that. I'm overstating that, I think, but yeah.
And that seems as good a place as any to end the first free hour. To hear the second hour, just go to patreon.com/themeltpodcast. And for as little as $3 a month, you can have access to full episodes, early episodes, and exclusive episodes, mainly of which are the recordings of our monthly Melt meetups. And actually, the next one is this Sunday at 5 p.m. Central Standard Time. And the topic, usually it's just sort of a launching point for these conversations, but the topic is in reference to the Howdy McCoskey episode last week, Where Is It We Are At? So if that sounds interesting to you and $3 sounds like something you can afford, we'd love to have you join the conversation. If for some reason you cannot afford $3, just send me an email, themeltpodcast@protonmail.com, and we will work something out. I don't want to exclude anybody from this, and if you're just not in a place to financially help out, I can totally understand that. I've been there myself. So anyway, yes, the meetups are very therapeutic, and there's something soothing about getting together with now, I was going to say like-minded people, but I think it's more accurate to say open-minded people to talk about subjects that just don't get brought up every day. So they're a lot of fun. All right. So in the second hour, we talk about Ahriman, Luciferic forces, the Three Easters, transhumanism, Madame Blavatsky, Krishnamurti, the threefold social order, and much, much more. I highly recommend that you listen to it. Dale is just like a walking Steiner encyclopedia. So in addition to the suggestions of how you can help the melt that you will hear in the outgoing theme, another one that can be added to that is visiting our merch store, and that link will be in the episode notes. And there you can consider it a one-time donation, and in return you get some cool melt merchandise. But we only have one design so far. That's the sort of the square purplish 3D melt logo thing, which I think is incredible, and I love that. But I would like to invite you all to submit different designs for melt merchandise, and I'm totally open to suggestions. So yeah, feel free to send those to themeltpodcast@protonmail.com. Thank you all so very, very much for listening. We really value your attention. And until next time, take care, people. If you've liked what you've heard and would like to contribute to the Melt, there are a few ways that you can do that. The most tangible would be financially. Just click the Patreon link in the episode notes, and there you will find ways that you can contribute for as little as $3 a month. This will give you access to bonus episodes, early access to regular episodes, and you can also participate in monthly Zoom meetups. Contributing financially will also help make the Melt better, pay the bills, and help to make this podcast a full-time endeavor that I can fully devote my time to and provide you with more content. Another way of contributing would be to go to wherever it is that you subscribe to the Melt and give it a favorable review or rating, and this will help it to reach more people. You can also spread the word to friends and family via social media, email, or word of mouth. And lastly, if none of those options are readily available or appealing to you, simply send your positive thoughts and intentions. In an interconnected and quantumly entangled multiverse, these also go a long way. Thank you.